Before the October 5th deadline, activist Desmond Meade, executive director of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, along with other activists, registered thousands of returning citizens to vote in Florida. Will these returning citizens be the deciding factor for Florida in the election? In California, Proposition 17 is on the ballot. Prop 17, which is supported by Senator and Vice Presidential running mate Kamala Harris, would allow people in California convicted of felonies who are on parole the right to vote. Right now, they are disqualified to vote until their incarceration and parole are completed. Prop 17 takes the rights of U.S. citizens to vote in the direction that it needs to go. The next step is to get prisoners currently incarcerated the right to vote. Only 2 states, Maine and Vermont, currently allow prisoners the right to vote. 2 states, mind you, where the majority of prisoners are white. So far, Bernie Sanders has been the only presidential candidate to support the idea of prisoners' rights to vote. Mississippi, Alabama, and Alaska also give prisoners the conditional right to vote depending on their convictions. To talk more about this, let's go to executive producer at The Real News and host of our show, Rattling the Bars, Eddie Conway, and talk about some of the issues around both prisoners' rights to voting and ex-prisoners' obstacles in their right to vote, particularly in Florida. Eddie, thank you so much for joining us tonight, man.
Okay, thanks for having me here.
So first off, I wanted to ask you if you could bring viewers up to speed and talk about some of the obstacles to registering returning citizens once they are released from prison or jail. I know in Florida, there is a law that requires former felons to pay exorbitant court costs before their rights can be restored, which, is essentially a poll tax. Widespread canvassing happened in Florida with the help of donors like Michael Bloomberg, John Legend, Michael Jordan, and even LeBron James, among others who helped pay court costs for former felons. So what are the obstacles around court costs for people just coming out of prison or jail?
Well, for one thing, and I know some people compare it to the Jim Crow jelly bean jar count that they used back in the past, where they would ask voters to determine how many black jelly beans or how many red jelly beans are in a jar in order to qualify to vote. Of course, they disqualified everybody. Well, now Florida is doing a similar version of that, because there's no way for a person that has spent years in the prison system to come out and negotiate the bureaucracy of finding out exactly what costs they owe, or what bureaucracy they need to be interacting with, whether it's child support or what have you. It's a crapshoot to find out if they owe anything, and if they pay the fines that they think they owe, but some other fines are outstanding, their vote still will be disqualified. So that's a hurdle that ex-prisoners, returning citizens find it very difficult to surmount.
A lot of people may not know this, but recently confirmed Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett was a young lawyer when she was called to help rescue thousands of Republican absentee ballots in the Gore v. Bush decision in the 2000 election. And we all know how that turned out. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that the Supreme Court will play a part in deciding the Florida election?
I think at this point, based on the challenge to the absentee ballots, I think it certainly will probably end up in the Supreme Court, which now obviously is a 6-3 conservative court. It's going to be a factor because, like I say, the jelly bean count itself is going to make a lot of votes invalid. So unless there's a tremendous win, right now it seems to be running neck and neck, 50%, unless there's some sort of a landslide. those votes are going to most likely be challenged. And Amy is going to be one of the people that's going to make that decision. And I think she helped the decision in the past through sleight of hand and skullduggery. And of course, Gore just didn't challenge it. Hopefully, Biden will challenge this.
So I know that what we're talking about is very serious, but I always appreciate an on-air drop of the term skullduggery, because points to Eddie. So, I know that this is something that you've covered a lot on your show here at the Real News Network, Rattling the Bars. And I wanted to ask if you could talk about the racial disparities and the dynamics at play in the disenfranchisement of voters with felony convictions, nearly 40% of whom are Black. Do you think that this refusal to restore the right to vote to former felons is a tactic to suppress the Black vote? Or even if that isn't the explicit intent, is that the effect?
Well, it's actually, the Sentencing Project reports the 40% number, but the numbers are actually closer to 75%. 3 out of 4 prisoners are people of color. They're not just Blacks, but that's inclusive of Latinos. It's inclusive of indigenous populations. And so about 75% of prisoners are disenfranchised. And so when you look at a number like 2 million, you're looking at 1.5 million of people at the minimum. But beyond that, there is, because of the loss of vote after conviction in most states, with the exception of about 19 states, you're looking at 6 million people, 6 million other people not being allowed to vote. So you're talking 8 to 9 million people all total that has lost their voting rights because of the color of their skin. And I'd like to point out that it's not mass incarceration, it's targeted incarceration, because that population, people of color, make up 25% of the American population, but they make up 75% of the prison population because of the institutional racism in the criminal justice system.
So we have a couple of minutes here, and I wanted to ask if we could round out by talking a little bit about kind of how this connects to the themes of your show, and how, from an insider's perspective, I was wondering if you could kind of tell listeners what you most want to get across about why it's so important for people who are still incarcerated to have the right to vote.
Well, it's very important because, for one, when you separate people from their communities and isolate them in far out communities from wherever they were incarcerated at, out in rural areas in most cases, in most states, they not only disappear from society, but they also lose an interest in what's going on in society. And then if you multiply that by a number of years, they lose the habit of even being concerned about what's going on in the community. And they don't see themselves as part of the community. And that in itself is detrimental. When they return back to the community, they're not only ostracized, but they're no longer committed and connected. The restoring the voting rights within prison systems would, in fact, help them stay connected, stay aware, stay conscious, and upon returning, reintegrate a lot easier.
And I know, like I said, that this is, the bread and butter of your show, Rattling the Bars, and you are actually kind of releasing a series right now where you have clips from 40 years ago, where actually to kind of prompt that sort of feeling of civic engagement and belonging that you were talking about, right? There was actually an initiative held 40 years ago where prisoners were encouraged to kind of think about and listen to speakers talk about kind of heavy issues involving politics, capitalism, imperialism. And since, you know, we have a couple minutes here before our next segment, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that series and how it speaks to kind of that kind of process that you were describing, where incarcerated folks are not only physically removed from society, but soulfully, psychologically, culturally, socially, in all aspects.
Yes, and I think if you look back at those series in the 70s and the 1980s, prison populations were very active in what was going on around the conditions that they lived under, but they were also involved in the larger community, and it created a better return. It created a safer community in the long run. And I think what happens over the years between the Prison Reform Acts and other acts, prisoners have been warehoused, and they have been warehoused in such a way that they no longer have the ability to enhance and enrich their lives. They no longer have the ability to look forward to doing other things other than to return to the activities that brought them into the prison system. That's deliberate. And I think one of the things that 40 years ago program shows is that prisons can be an area in which we can educate people, we can organize people, and we can help develop a better society. And at that point, we were talking about the 13th Amendment. We were talking about voting rights. We were talking about conditions, and we were talking about how to stop the exploitation, because that's really what prisons are about right now. They're about making money off of slave labor. That's what the 13th Amendment says. All slavery had been abolished except for those people convicted in the prison system. And so slavery still continues to exist in America today. And now, unfortunately, because most prisons are located in far-flung rural areas, rural white areas, that is, most prisoners are coming from urban areas. They're Black. 75% of those populations are Black or brown. And they end up in an all-white rural area with white guards. And it's a really very conflicting situation, a clash of culture, a clash of race, ethnicity. It's a clash of even religion. And it just creates very hostile tensions outside the cities and inside the cities. And of course, I maintain that the violence we see in the city is created in the prison systems because of the abuse and the destruction that prisoners undergo while they're in those isolated areas.
So that is Real News executive producer and host of the show Rattling the Bars, Eddie Conway. You can watch Eddie's show on our YouTube page and on our website, therealnews.com. Eddie, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts tonight, man.
Okay, thanks for having me.